여러분, 지금 비트코인 시장에 숨겨진 함정이 있다면 믿으시겠습니까? 이 함정은 과거 2000년 닷컴 버블, 2008년 금융위기 때마다 정확히 터졌던 역대급 경고 시그널입니다. 해외 월가 전문가들은 이 지표가 비트코인을 50% 폭락시킬 수 있다고 경고합니다. 하지만 동시에 이 폭락을 막을 수 있는 하나의 희망 시그널이 포착되었는데요. 과연 이 경고 지표는 무엇이며 비트코인의 진짜 운명은 어떻게 될까요?
This line that you see here, moving up and down, shows us one of the most important macro forces for Bitcoin. It tracks how hard it is for companies to borrow money, giving us a direct read on how freely liquidity is moving through the system. This is a concept known as credit spread. When this line rises, investors demand more compensation to lend money, signaling tighter liquidity. And when it falls, lenders become more comfortable, reflecting abundant liquidity and stronger appetite for risk. Recently, this line has been rising from levels we've only seen in 1997 and 2007. In both instances, credit spreads went on to surge aggressively, becoming a key trigger behind the dot-com bubble pop in 2000 and the financial crisis in 2008. Today, companies are borrowing at much higher rates, and lending standards continue to tighten across the banking system. There's also a $1.6 trillion credit bubble building beneath the surface, significantly increasing the risks, something we'll cover later in this video. If we were to see something similar play out today, it would have major implications for Bitcoin.
여기 나오는 신용 스프레드라는 개념이 너무 어려우신가요? 쉽게 말해 시장이 지금 돈 빌려주기 찝찝해 라고 외치는 심리 지표입니다. 이 수치가 치솟으면 곧 대형 참사가 터진다는 역대급 시그널이었죠. 2000년, 2008년 위기. 과연 이번에도 반복될까요? 바로 다음 구간에서 비트코인과의 관계를 깊이 파헤쳐 보겠습니다.
Think of credit spreads as the market's way of telling us how much risk investors are willing to take on. When a company wants to borrow money by issuing bonds, investors demand extra compensation above what they would receive from U.S. Treasury bonds. That extra yield is the credit spread. For example, if the 10-year Treasury is at 4.2% and a 10-year corporate bond is at 6.2%, the 2% difference is the credit spread. When credit spreads rise sharply, companies face higher borrowing costs, which weakens future growth expectations. But the real damage comes from forced selling because hedge funds and leveraged investors who depend on cheap financing are suddenly hit with margin calls and liquidity stress. That's why rising spreads typically lead to sharp drawdowns in the US stock market. And every time spreads have crossed above 10%, like 2001, 2008, and 2020, it has coincided with episodes of systemic stress that led to an economic recession. Each crisis seemed like an isolated event, but they were all connected by the same cheap credit driving risky behavior. Now, if we replace the US stock market with Bitcoin, a clear relationship emerges. When spreads rise, it coincides with vicious declines on Bitcoin. And when spreads fall, it creates an ideal backdrop for Bitcoin to thrive. The correlation coefficient between the two is around negative 0.6, indicating a strong inverse relationship. So even without rate hikes, rising credit spreads act as a form of hidden tightening, draining liquidity from the system. And we saw this very clearly in March 2020, when the pandemic hit and credit spreads spiked from 3% to 11%. Bitcoin collapsed by 50%. So Bitcoin trades more like a leveraged risk asset during liquidity-driven systemic stress, rather than a safe haven. And credit spreads are one of the earliest warning signals for when that stress is building. Now, we have some good news and some bad news. The good news is that many large US corporations used the pandemic to refinance their debt at extremely low rates when money was cheap. For example, Apple issued $8.5 billion worth of bonds in 2020, with spreads as low as 0.55%. And Microsoft refinanced $4 billion that same year at rates around 0.7%. Companies like these could easily survive a credit freeze today, even if spreads were to spike sharply. But the bad news is that the average US company doesn't look anything like Apple or Microsoft. According to the Fed's data, corporate debt to GDP is still sitting near 45%, a level also seen before the 2001 and 2008 crisis. And unlike the megacaps, much of this debt is floating rate, which means even a small rise in credit spreads not only makes new borrowing more expensive, but it also increases the cost of their existing debt. There's also a larger concern emerging in the private credit space. the part of the market where non-bank institutions lend directly to companies. Since 2008, this market has gone from $230 billion to more than $1.6 trillion, equivalent to about 5% of US GDP. Most of these loans carry floating rates and come with looser requirements than traditional bank financing. The problem is that private credit doesn't show up in traditional credit spread indicators. So while standard credit measures might look stable on surface, they are only tracking the companies that banks and major institutions are comfortable lending to. But the riskier companies that are more vulnerable to rising spreads are hidden in the private markets. An IMF report recently highlighted that banks have become a key source of leverage for private credit firms. If this sector comes under stress, the shock would spill directly into the regulated banking system. This can create a negative feedback loop, as stress in private credit puts pressure on bank liquidity, forcing the banks to tighten their lending, which would squeeze private credit firms further, applying greater pressure on the banking system. Today, 6.5% of banks are tightening their lending standards, as we can see from this chart. But this number has come down significantly from the 51% reading we saw in 2023. In other words, even though some banks are tightening, the vast majority are not, which means overall lending conditions still remain favorable. If we put credit spreads on top of this chart, we see a very close relationship between these two lines. In fact, shifts in bank lending standards have often preceded major moves in credit spreads. So with fewer banks tightening today, credit availability appears to be improving. And if that's the case, then any move higher in credit spreads is likely to remain limited and short-lived for now. Of course, if banks start significantly tightening their lending standards again, we'll be quick to readjust our strategy. But that's not what the data is showing right now. In fact, if we zoom in and replace credit spreads with Bitcoin's yearly returns, we see something even more interesting. When the share of banks tightening lending standards is rising, it coincides with a weak performance on Bitcoin. And when that line is falling, it tends to create a supportive environment for Bitcoin. Since late 2023, lending standards have been easing, signaling that credit conditions continue to favor risk assets like Bitcoin. And as long as that remains the case, we remain constructive on Bitcoin, despite the potential for more short-term volatility.
오늘 핵심을 가장 짧고 강력하게 요약하자면 이렇습니다. 기업 부채와 신용 스프레드는 여전히 잠재적 폭탄이지만 은행들이 대출 빗장을 풀면서 비트코인 같은 위험 자산 시장에 강력한 유동성을 공급하고 있습니다. 결국 단기 변동성은 있겠지만 지금의 데이터가 비트코인에게 매우 우호적이라고 결론 내렸습니다. 투자의 결정은 언제나 여러분의 몫이지만 이런 중요한 정보를 놓치고 싶지 않으시다면 구독과 좋아요 부탁드립니다. 다음 영상에서 더 유익한 정보로 찾아뵙겠습니다. 감사합니다.